Are you at the end of your rope with some person or situation? Exasperated about the unfairness of a situation or circumstance in your life? Are anger, depression, sadness, or fear constantly invading your thoughts and affecting your health, wellness, and even performance? What if there were some specific strategy you could tap into that would minimize those emotions and help turn your focus back to making the most of this life and its opportunities? Welcome to the Catalyst 360 podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360, and today's guest is Donald Robertson, cognitive behavioral psychotherapist and best-selling author of several books, including Verissimus, The Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. You've likely read or even seen the explosion of interest in Stoicism, not only with Robertson's books, but others like Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy, The Obstacle is the Way, and Stillness is the Key. We'll be digging into the practical aspects of Stoicism and the role it can play in making our lives and our world a better place. For the employers, benefit consultants, and wellness providers out there, now is obviously that key window of time when plans are being dialed in to help support employee team members. If you're still looking for that missing link, the behavioral, physical, and mental well-being coaching available from Catalyst Coaching 360 can be integrated into any current program or platform with guaranteed outcomes. Interested in learning more? Email me directly. We can set up some time to talk. It's bcooper@catalystcoaching360.com, and we can talk about options and whether it's the right fit as you move forward. You can also check out the website, catalystcoaching360.com. And now, it's time to tap into the ageless wisdom of Stoicism with best-selling author Donald Robertson on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Donald, it is a privilege to have you join us. Stoicism is getting a lot of attention now. It's not a new thing, but for some reason, it is on people's radar. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Yeah, I think Stoicism has become kind of trendy. Like I like to say, ancient Greco-Roman philosophy is the future.
Oh, I love it.
Unlikely as that may seem, it kind of is. It's become popular.
Yeah. So Marcus Aurelius, the focus of your writing and even your new book that's just come out, what would he say about today? Like if he were living today and he was in some kind of a role where we could invite him on the show and say, Marcus, what's your advice for us out there? We'll dig into Stoicism more deeply, but just off the top, what would he advise right now?
Oh, in a way, that's easy. I mean, he's going to be pretty perplexed by the technology, first of all, so you're going to have to give him a minute, to adapt. He's going to think it's witchcraft or something. But his advice to us would be very consistent, like Stoic advice. The reason it's still popular today is because it's based on a philosophy of life that's so fundamental. Applies across different times and cultures, and in fact already did, because Marcus was following a philosophy that was developed 500 years before his death.
Prior to him, yeah.
In Athens. So, I don't know, like that to us, that would be like following a philosophy from 1500 and a different country, a different language, and yet it's still relevant to the Roman Empire. And people in different levels of society. He was studying the writings of a philosopher called Epictetus, who was a crippled slave. The lower ranks of Roman society, and Marcus, of course, was a Roman emperor in the top ranks of Roman society. And yet they both found Stoicism equally relevant. So he would tell us that the main thing is we need to reflect very deeply on what the point of anything is. So before we look at how we could be more successful, before we look at life hacks, before we look at optimizing our performance, we have to figure out what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. We have to be clear about our fundamental goal in life. As Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, said, no wind is favorable to a ship that doesn't know to which port it's attempting to sail. So Marcus would say, then you guys don't even know what it is you're trying to achieve, so that's why you're all over the place. And the Stoics believe that nature, in a sense, gives us a goal. They're what we call ethical naturalists. They don't think it's all subjective. They think human nature has a goal. It's to realize the potential that exists within us as thinking, self-aware beings. So nature gave us the ability to think. Socrates pointed this out. So we can think. And thinking is inherently goal-directed, whether we like it or not. Nobody thinks about stuff in order to be wrong about the most important things in life anyway, right? So we implicitly already have a goal, which is to think rationally and arrive at the truth concerning the most important things that we're thinking about. And if we did that consistently, if we consistently thought rationally and grasped the fundamental truths, we would have attained the virtue of wisdom. And so the Stoics say the goal of life is wisdom. It's not rocket science. They would say, you guys are confusing the hell out of yourselves. Like, you're reasoning beings. Your function in life is to reason well. And at the moment, you're doing it really badly. You had one job, Marcus would say to us, and that was to think clearly, use your brain properly, and you're not even trying to do it. He would say to us all, he quotes a passage from Socrates, and actually we don't know where he gets this from. There's this little snippet of dialogue where Socrates, presumably from a lost dialogue, is saying to people, do you have the souls or the minds, we would say, the psyche of a rational being or an irrational being? Are you capable of language and self-awareness and stuff? And they say, well, we have the souls of rational beings. And Socrates says, well, shouldn't you be trying to teach yourself how to do that properly, to reason well then? And they say, well, we already are reasoning well, we think. And Socrates replies to them and says, well, how come you're always arguing with each other all the time then? Which is a very valid observation today if you go on the internet. Everybody thinks that they are being rational, but they're always arguing with each other all over social media. So Socrates said, that's a warning sign there that maybe you're not being as rational as you could be. You're not doing the one job that you had, which is to use your brain and to think logically about life. And that's the advice that we give us. Be clear about your fundamental goal. And also notice when you're straying from it. So Marcus, throughout his notes, the meditations, keeps reminding himself to drag himself back to the fundamental goal of life. He says to himself, most of the things that you do and most of the things you think about each day are not relevant to your fundamental goal in life. So people worry that life is short, but actually they waste 99% of their time doing stuff that doesn't really serve the very thing that on reflection they themselves would concede to be their most important goal. And then you die. So, and just before that, you're lying on your deathbed and you look back on your life and you think, geez, I wish I'd watched more episodes of Friends. Or you think, geez, if only I'd spent more time arguing with people on Twitter. Or actually you don't. Nobody's going to think that, unless they're crazy, on their deathbed. And this is why the Stoics think we should visualize our death and rehearse it, because they think it snaps us out the trance. If we imagine what it would be like, lying on our deathbed and looking back on the whole of our life, it helps us to think more independently, to snap out of the prevailing norms and values of our society, so just to wake up, to snap out of the trance and think, was the stuff that you were doing throughout your life really that important? Was it that important to make more money, to buy a bigger house or a fancier car or whatever? Could you have spent your life doing stuff that you yourself could have taken more pride in, that might have been more fulfilling? I think anybody, I can tell you as a therapist, we often work with clients on their values, for example. And one of the questions that many therapists would ask their clients today is to identify their core values as part of treatment. For example, one of the leading evidence-based treatments for clinical depression is behavioral activation, and it employs a technique called values clarification. So clarify the client's values, they have a little think about it, they'll go away, have a little word with themselves, they figure out what their core values are, eventually. It takes a bit of effort to do that, but and then the therapist might say, well, okay, so your core value is to be kind to other people or something, let's say. That's what, you really value. It's what's important to you. How much time in the past 24 hours, in minutes or hours, did you spend acting in the service of that value, like doing stuff to be kind to others or to improve your ability to be kind to others. And my experience is the most common answer to that question is 0, which kind of shocked me at first. Sometimes it's not, but a lot of people will say none, like no minutes. Like, did I spend yesterday? And then they die, like, eventually, right? So it's shocking in a way that so many people, after 5 minutes of reflection, would be able to tell you that they spent 0 minutes doing stuff that accords with what they consider
number one.
To be the most. And then that hits them on their deathbed. Yeah. Like, that's when it's going to come back to haunt them, buddy. When they're about to take their final breath and they look back and think, geez, man, I spent 0 minutes doing the thing that I thought was most important in life. Right. So the Stoics are all about that. Marcus would say, you guys need to snap out of it, like, because you only get one chance at this.
Well, okay, so let's chase that rabbit trail a little bit.
Thinking about your mortality would help. Yeah.
So, and I hadn't planned to ask you this, but you talk about thinking to arrive at the truth, and then why are we arguing? Because if you're being rational, you're arguing. Let me have you clarify that a little bit, because I think a lot of people think their arguing is them being rational. They're proving how rational they are by showing how smart they are with their whatever. You're right. There's no conversation. There's only stating my position right now. It seems like. So am I hearing you right that if we're truly being rational, the argument's not there because I'm listening, I'm intrigued, I'm curious? How does that pull together?
It could be that. Well, for a bunch of reasons, I would say. It might be that we're listening more to the other person's position. It might be that we're more willing to have our own position disproved. Epicurus said, he was not a Stoic, a rival school of philosophy, around at the same time. He said, so the Greek Stoics, Greek philosophers loved paradoxes, and so do I. And Socrates was very famous for his love of paradoxes. And the Stoics were also very, very famous for their love of paradoxes. But most Greek philosophers loved the paradox. And it's another thing, like the Zen koan, that can snap us out of the trance a little bit. So the paradox originally meant something contrary to popular opinion, right? So it meant something that would shock you. It seems the opposite of what most people believe. Epicurus said that in a philosophical argument, the person who gains most is the person who loses the argument.
Love that.
Which is the opposite of what most people assume. Because he said the guy that wins the argument doesn't learn anything.
Didn't change.
Like, what does he get from it? An ego boost or something? Yeah. Like, what was the point of it? The person that loses the argument maybe gets his ego bruised or something, but he actually learns something. Now, I think in a way that was the most Socratic thing. That Epicurus didn't allegedly like Socrates much, but that was the most Socratic thing Epicurus ever said, because Socrates was very much like that. He was very humble. He was very self-questioning. He was very open. And he was very tolerant of disagreement. Epictetus, the Stoic, the most famous Stoic teacher, who Marcus Aurelius studied his writings, he said he loved Socrates, and he said the most important thing we learn from Socrates, he was talking, we have a record of what he says to his students, like a transcription of his class. And he says to his students, the most important thing we learn from Socrates? And now, today, a philosophy student would say, I don't know, like if it's via Plato, would it be Plato's theory of forms, or would it be some kind of theory about knowledge or virtue or something like that? Nothing like that. Like, Epictetus says the main thing we learn from Socrates is how to discuss the most important things in life without it degenerating into a squabble.
Interesting.
Like, which is remarkable. It's about the process rather than the content. It's about tolerance of disagreement, which is something that people find very difficult now, I think. And, I think it's one of the most important things that we need to restore to modern society. The reason that in many countries, and I think most notably just because it's dominating the news in America, like we have, one of a bigger problem than many people even realize. And I know it's in the news, but still it's bigger than people realize, is the problem with domestic terrorism. Like in the US, there are armed militia groups all over America, like never before. In the UK, we had for many years the troubles in Northern Ireland with the IRA.
Sure.
but they had hunting rifles and things, right? And little pipe bombs and balaclavas. Like, these guys in America have got, really advanced military grade weapons. And a lot of them are ex-military dudes, like ex-police. It's very, very, far more dangerous situation, like, in that regard.
And there's no conversation happening.
It's
not even on the table.
Social media is, without a shadow of doubt in my mind, social media contributes to the threat, because social media, for whatever reason, has many advantages, but it seems to encourage conflict and a lack of tolerance of disagreement. And it seems to encourage people to adopt entrenched, extreme political and ideological.
The algorithm's feeding you more of you. Well, it makes perfect sense, because if I'm
like an echo chamber.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's exactly an echo chamber. All right,
Marcus would think this is a problem. He would, but in ancient philosophy, famously, now wherever you find Socrates, what else do you find? Right now, if you read Plato, everywhere Socrates goes, he pops up. He hangs around the sophists. Like in Plato, if you find a sophist, Socrates is not far away. Like, they're his frenemies. Like, he has a love-hate relationship with these guys. He really does. He quotes them. Like, he's friends with some of them. He goes around and hangs out and has dinner with them. But he's also extremely fundamentally critical of these guys. And I used to think the sophists were guys, we would maybe even call them philosophers. They were quasi-philosophers in the ancient world. It was a profession. It's where we get the word sophistication from. So sophistication is what sophists taught young Athenian noblemen. Like, they would teach them about culture and literature. They would teach them rhetoric and train them in oratory. And they would give lectures. And they were the world's greatest public speakers. They were self-improvement gurus, you would say, or kind of spiritual leaders. All of these things all rolled into one. And they toured the world like rock stars. Like, they went from one city to another, became fabulously wealthy. Thousands of people would turn out to listen to them, and they dressed in extravagant clothing, some of them, and became charged enormous fees for their courses and lectures. They were celebrities. They were rock stars of the day. And Socrates hung out with these guys because they talked a lot about virtue and wisdom and stuff like that, and he liked some of their ideas. But he said, look, the problem with you guys, though, is that you don't care about the truth, that you have sold out, as we would put it today, and that you literally compete one against the other to see, they have competitions for giving oratory. And whoever gets the biggest round of applause, like on the clapometer, would win money or win a goat or something, whatever the prize happens. Probably a lot of money. There's a lot of money in this for these guys. Traditionally, goats were given as prizes. But the guy that impresses the audience gets the biggest round of applause. So they're going to say stuff that's sensational. They're going to try and use persuasion and manipulation. Like, they're going to play to the audience. Socrates says, you guys have sold out, because you've fallen into this trap where you're competing against one another to impress the audience, and truth doesn't matter to you anymore. Like, you'll say whatever the audience wants to hear. And that's how this whole system, this whole scam in a way, is operating. Now, I used to think the sophists were all dead. Because this was a long time ago.
It sounds like you're talking about right now. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then I thought social media influencers are potentially in the similar game if they're not careful. They're faced with the same temptations, the same problems. We have scandals now. Like, the BBC News exposed just a few weeks ago that because people contacted them, social media influencers contacted the BBC and said to them, people are contacting us. Some Russians guys were contacting them, as it happened, and said, we'd like you to put out anti-vaccine stuff on your channel, and we'll pay you to do it. And the guys that were looking at it said, we don't like the stuff that you're sending us looks like, BS. We don't really agree with this. And And then the BBC researched it, and they found evidence that other social media influencers were putting the same content out. Like, it kind of looked like, either by coincidence, they're, whatever, they're saying stuff that these other guys provided evidence that they were being offered money to say. I think it's an open secret that a lot of influencers are paid money to promote
no doubt.
things and to spread propaganda, maybe even politically sometimes. So this has always been a problem. Now the internet's like the Wild West. It's unregulated. So it's become a much more serious, a deeper, more profound problem. But also the algorithms contribute. So we now have a kind of digital sophist. Facebook itself is a sophist. Twitter itself is a sophist, in a sense. Like, it functions. Its algorithms function in a way like the ancient sophist function. Socrates said this is very dangerous for society. We have an obligation to protect ourselves against being manipulated psychologically and emotionally by these institutions or these individuals that have it in their financial interests to whip up the crowd, to exploit the mob, to say sensationalist things. And, the easiest way to do that is to use fear and anger, which you'll find all over the internet now are people deliberately stoking fear and anger. Why? Because it naturally captivates people's attention for longer. And then you have an audience that way.
So 3,000 years later, it's the same issue that he was fighting with. Yeah.
The Stoics said that anger is temporary madness. So that's what we have. We have media, news media, and social media that provoke anger because it gets your attention. And then that makes people stupid. Anger is a form of stupidity. Now, that might seem like a strange thing to say, but I'll substantiate. I think it's actually a surprisingly easy point to substantiate. There are reams of modern research that show pretty clearly that when people are in a heightened emotional state, they exhibit pronounced cognitive biases on many, many levels. People who are really angry have an impaired ability to think objectively and rationally. There's no question about that. We know that. We can prove it in multiple ways. They're rubbish at problem solving, right? And particularly complex problems. A simple problem is maybe fixing a broken washer on a tap or something, right? You hit yourself and hurt your thumb when you're doing it. You get really mad and you throw your spanner across the room, right? And suddenly it becomes difficult to even finish what should be a relatively simple mechanical task. That's easy, right? So if anger prevents you from even solving a simple problem like that, what chance do you have of solving the spider's web of intricate problems that constitute human relationships? Human problems are far more complex than fixing a broken tap. Yeah, how are you going to do that when you're angry? How are you going to fix society's problems when you're angry? It would be like repairing a broken spider's web with a pair of marigolds on. You're not in the right frame of mind at all to do it, and the Stoics knew this. For example, we know that when people are angry, they have a cognitive bias in favor of underestimating risk, right? Ironically, people associate anger with strength, like the Hulk or something like that, right? And many people have this weird prejudice that they think anger is a type of strength, that it's manly or something like that, some sort of BS like that. Anger is a form of weakness. Any intelligent person realizes, for example, sportsmen typically realize that anger, in many instances, in competitive sport, becomes a weakness. A good example would be in any situation where there's conflict. My favorite example is the Rumble in the Jungle. Muhammad Ali fighting George Foreman. Muhammad Ali realized that George Foreman's biggest weakness was that he couldn't control his temper. Mm-hmm. And so he taunted him mercilessly in the ring and provoked him. And so what did George Foreman do? He underestimated, because he was angry, he underestimated the risk of exhausting himself in the first few rounds of the fight. Because that's what people do when they're angry. They take risks. Because we know, it's the same trap that they always fall into. They drop their guard, they exhaust themselves, they expose themselves to risk. Even worse, they expose other people around them to risk. Because angry people underestimate risk in general. And that, because they're exposing themselves and other people to risk, that's weakness, fragility. angry people are the most fragile people you'll ever meet. Like, they're the most vulnerable people you'll ever meet. And yet they believe the opposite, which makes is an even greater threat to themselves, because it's a pronounced cognitive bias. Anger, in its very nature, is a form of stupidity. And the Stoics knew that. They thought anger was the biggest threat to their society. We have an entire book by Seneca. We only have less than 1% of the original Stoic literature survives today. But luckily, among it, we have an entire book by Seneca about Stoic therapy for anger, which is astoundingly ahead of its time. It's anger management experts today who read that book will say, of all the things you could find in ancient literature, like this, half of this looks like it could have been written today. It's very simple, sometimes very profound psychological advice.
Okay, so I want to take part of that and take a little detour here. A lot of folks, if they've never read about Stoicism or dug into it or read your books, they're like, oh yeah, Stoicism, that's the one where you just kind of bite your lip and you tough your way through things. That's the understanding some people have by thinking, oh, I'm going to have a Stoic attitude. That's not at all what it is. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's because most people are wrong about most things. And I don't know, I hate to break it to people, but if you go on the internet and Google stuff, a lot of the information that's on the internet is wrong.
What?
Dun, dun, dun.
What?
I know.
Say it ain't so.
I just found that out, honestly, but I just found that out yesterday. Apparently it's not all the information on the internet's reliable. Wow. Some of it's wrong. Apparently, some of the stuff on the internet, it turns out, is BS. Right? I didn't know that. But someone told me yesterday. No, there's a lot of information on the internet that's wrong. Man, my favourite thing in a way is there are so many quotations. It's almost like a joke now. One day, there's so many quotes from ancient philosophers that are just fake.
Yeah, or Abraham Lincoln.
Usually the next... Yeah, it's crazy. And they'll be next to a statue of the wrong guy anyway, and also just nonsense, right? But it's so prevalent now that stuff finds its way even into books. And you'll be reading a book going, this quote is made up, man. It just comes up on the internet. It's not a real thing that dude ever said. People get lazy, and they depend on the internet for information. And it's sadly, particularly with regard to ancient philosophy, full of misinformation. Now, the most common misconception about Stoicism is that it means something like having a stiff upper lip, which would mean, but when we say stiff upper lip, we mean your lip would tremble when you're nervous or angry, and so you'd be kind of like having a poker face and trying to conceal the fact that you're nervous or angry by kind of freezing your features. That's what that describes. Some people even seem to be confused about what that phrase means, right? It means repressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions from other people is how we would define what people call lowercase Stoicism. So the word Stoicism we spell with lowercase has come to mean this kind of the stupidest and crudest form of emotional coping conceivable to man, right? Which is just to run away from your emotions or to try and hide them, right? So this is the blunt instrument of emotional intelligence. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to try and hide the fact that I'm feeling an emotion. It's push it down, conceal it or something. I'm not going to let other people see it. Right. I'm going to run away or whatever. It's a form of avoidance, right? It's an avoidant form of emotional coping. Now, again, paradoxically, people think that lowercase Stoicism makes you like a tough guy, right? Makes you fragile. It's the ultimate snowflake way of coping with emotions, right? There are, again, a bunch of modern studies from different types of researchers in psychology and other branches of social science and health research, different research teams around the world using different research instruments over decades that have consistently found evidence that what we call lowercase Stoicism, having kind of stuff up a lip, repressing or concealing unpleasant, embarrassing emotions, leads to several different psychological behavioral problems in the long term. Sure. Or the long and short of it is makes you fragile as a big snowflake, right? because people who repress or conceal emotions in that crude way are more prone to developing clinical depression and anxiety disorders in the long term. So that's the polar opposite of what we technically refer to as emotional resilience. This is emotional vulnerability. Like, people think lowercase stoicism makes them resilient. It does the complete opposite, ironically, right? So that's how dumb that is. Like we were saying about anger a moment ago. People think it makes them stronger, makes them weaker, makes them fragile, like to cope with emotions in that way. Now, that may be because in some situations with an acute problem, if you're at the dentist and something hurts for a second, maybe just distracting yourself like would be a reasonable way to cope. But it doesn't work long term. It's not going to work in a relationship. It's not going to work in your career to cope with emotions by hiding them or running away from them. Like, it's the most cowardly, simplistic, dumb way.
But Stoicism does long-term provide a way to effectively use our emotions, correct?
Ancient Stoicism we spell with a capital S. Now, I know that's confusing to people, but it's two words that sound the same and they mean different things, right? So we capitalize one. And now this is true of many different branches of Greek philosophy. It's just because over the course of history, for a number of reasons, culturally, historically, the names of ancient schools of philosophy and related concepts became degraded, caricatured over time, right? So Epicureanism today is, people have restaurants and things, or like shops that they call like Epicurus and stuff. Right. Today, being an Epicurean today means being like a gourmand, somebody like who kind of like stuffs their face with fine foods and things like that. Like, ancient Epicureanism was a branch of Greek philosophy that was almost the opposite. It meant living a very simple, it meant enjoying the simplest things in life, basically, to put it crudely. Cynicism was an ancient Greek school of philosophy. Does mean something different from what lowercase cynicism means today. Academic meant something different. Sophist meant something different. Skeptic meant something different. All of these words have been caricatured or changed their meaning over the intervening 2,000 or 2,500 years, right? So Stoicism is the one that we're talking about. Ancient Stoicism was a very nuanced, sophisticated emotional theory. It was the original inspiration in the 1950s for modern cognitive psychotherapy. And so it inspired the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy. And so there's a lot of indirect evidence that Stoic concepts and practices are good for mental health and lead to genuine emotional resilience. Because genuine evidence-based modern emotional resilience training, which is a thing, is largely based on cognitive psychotherapy, which is in turn originally inspired by ancient Stoic philosophy.
So can you give us an example? Can you walk us down just an example of, somebody that feels like their emotions are getting a hold of them, they're not providing the positive boost, they're distracting them, they're putting them on the wrong path. Can you give an example of how Stoicism would begin to help that person make some positive adjustments? Okay, so the first thing is, let's back up a little bit, right? Because the first thing is a concept, right? We have to have the right framework in place for the techniques. We have to know what your goal is, or to which, which direction you're sailing in. So right out the gate, the Stoics, following Socrates, had a cognitive model of emotion, right? And that's why they inspired cognitive therapy. Now, I'm a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, so my belief is that the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy was the biggest advance in modern psychological therapy, full stop, right? So we inherit our folk psychology, our ordinary language inherits a Platonic theory of emotion, which talks about feelings as if they're separate from thinking. So we've got reason and the passions. Traditionally, we talk about it. We've got reason, we've got the passions. They're two different things. That's how people talk about it. And it also leads to what psychologists have sometimes called the lump theory of emotion, by which I mean that people talk about emotions in, again, the stupidest possible language, the most simplistic language. So people talk about anger as if it's just like a thing. I've got this anger, right?
What if anger is composite in nature? And it consists of a number of ingredients. What if there's different types of anger that we could distinguish that function differently? Talking about anger as if it's just a big homogenous thing suddenly seems pretty dumb and naive and overly simplistic, right? And
distracting. It puts you on the wrong path then if you're just grouping it into one thing.
To even make a beginning at dealing intelligently with our emotions, we need to differentiate between different types of emotion. And we need to distinguish between different ingredients. Like it's a mechanism, like a clock. We need to open it up and go, there's different cogs and screws in it. Anger, anxiety, and depression, each one of them is a cake baked of many different ingredients, right? It's not just a big homogeneous block.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, it consists of action tendencies. So the desire to lash out or run away, facial expressions and body language. It consists of cognitions on different levels, underlying beliefs, values, styles of thinking, ways of allocating attention, and physical sensations. All rolled together, all these ingredients combined together to bake the cake of anger or anxiety or depression, right? Now, once you know that, you can say, well, what if we just take away one of those ingredients? We don't put the flour in the cake. You end up with something that's not a cake anymore. When we're nice to eat, right? But once we realize that, emotions which people say they can't control suddenly become much more fragile and easier to control.
Wow.
Because you just need to take that cog out, right? But if you're not even making that decision, it just seems like a big glass orb. You can't get any purchase on it. But if you open it up and go, there's all these different components. We just need to adjust one of them and change it. You have to start by distinguishing between different types of anxiety, different types of anger, and then looking inside it and looking at the components. But our language doesn't lend itself to that because we're all stupid. We're emotionally unintelligent. The English language and most modern languages have an incredibly simplistic emotional vocabulary. That is not fit for purpose, basically. It's very primitive compared to the complexity of our emotional life, right? So we're hamstrung right out of the cradle with this rubbish language, that makes it hard for us to differentiate between different feelings. So the point I wanted to make was, for me, as a cognitive behavioral practitioner, the key thing would be the role of cognitions that people normally ignore. And I can best explain that with the following vignette.
Okay.
Client comes into every single client comes into therapy or coaching or counselling, and they sit in a nice comfortable chair. Nowadays, they used to be on a chaise longue or whatever, but now they usually get a little chair to sit in a little room, And the therapist says, "Tell me about your problem then." And they have maybe a bunch of questions, when does it happen? Where does it happen? What are you thinking, feeling? Who are you around? Has it got better or worse over time? When did it first start? Yada, yada, yada. All the kind of usual stuff.
Sure.
History taking, whatnot. All right. And so but basically what the client is doing, in a sense, is painting a picture of their suffering. And so to paraphrase every single client, they'll say, "I've got this problem with anger, anxiety, depression, whatever, and it's horrible. I'm only coming to see you." And they'll say, "No offense to you, but I'm only here as a last resort.
Sure, yeah.
Because I've tried everything else and nothing."
Or my wife sent me.
Right? Yeah. So the therapist will think, "Well, gee, buddy, thanks, right? But I won't take it personally. But I'm only here. I'm desperate. Because this is ruining my life. It's destroying my marriage. It's keeping me awake at night. It's affecting my performance at work. It's making me miserable. I've become withdrawn, yada, yada, yada." So there's a long list of complaints that the client will have about how the presenting problem is destroying their life on many different levels, right? Now, implicitly, without realizing it, they've now just given themselves a whole bunch of reasons to stop doing it. And they realize that at some point in the session, and then typically in so many words, in some shape or form, having realized that's what they've just done, they'll say, "I know it's awful and it's terrible and it's destroying my marriage and all this kind of stuff, but I can't help it. It's just how I feel." They'll say,
"Just who I am."
Not really, but how I feel. And Albert Ellis, in the 1950s, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, which is the kind of original or prototypical form of cognitive therapy, he'd read the Stoics from adolescence. He read them as a teen. And Ellis would lean forward and he'd say something really cool at that point, which I think is the right thing to say, actually. He'd say, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. Dun, dun, dun. And to me, that's of seismic, seminal importance in the history of psychotherapy. I'll tell you why, right? Because it's easy for someone to say, it's just how I feel, I can't really help it. And that's an expression of what we sometimes in therapy call stuckness, right? Or hopelessness. So the client says, I can't do anything about it. Like, I've got zero coping ability to deal with that. Like, I can't help feelings, right? Thoughts are different, though. Like, thoughts have what we can call propositional content. They're true or false, right? And so we instinctively have a different reaction when we realize that we are acting upon holding a thought that's true or that's false, or two thoughts that contradict one another, like, and create cognitive dissonance. Right? There's a very hardwired reaction to cognitive dissonance and realizing that our thoughts are contradictory or in conflict with reality at some level. Socrates knew that. It's the basis of the Socratic method. But you have to recognize that it's not just how you feel, it's also how you think. For example, clients have panic attacks. Freud had no idea how to treat panic attacks. Psychotherapists, for a long time, thought panic attacks were largely biological. Here's why. They respond to tricyclic antidepressants. Like, they're more common among women than among men. And there seems to be a hereditary element in them, and they're unresponsive to talking therapy. So for all those reasons, psychiatrists used to say, maybe this is a biological problem rather than a behavioral or psychological one. And then they changed their mind. In the early 1980s, they changed their mind. Because a psychologist in the UK called David Clarke developed a protocol for the treatment of panic attacks. It was cognitive behavioral in nature that suddenly took it from zero to hero. Even people who are critics of cognitive behavioral therapy today recognize that the cognitive therapy for panic disorder and agoraphobia has a very high success rate in a relatively short space of time because they nailed it. Like, they suddenly figured out a way to treat it. Now, there are several elements to that, right? One of those elements is that people who have panic attacks, and again, this comes back to, we have to distinguish, panic attacks are different from phobic anxiety, different from generalized anxiety. So we would have no chance of working with anxiety intelligently unless we distinguish
break it down.
Different types,
right?
Break it down that function in a different way, have a different prognosis, respond to different treatment strategies. Anxiety, we use the word anxiety, it covers half a dozen different things, right? And so there's different types of anxiety. Panic attacks are one type of anxiety. And even then, within that, we can dissect it. It takes different forms. There's behavioral elements, like there's affective, like there's physical, sensory elements. There's attentional components to it. And there's different types of cognitive elements to it. Now, one of them is the underlying belief that there's a bias in most forms of anxiety that involves overestimating the severity and probability of threat and underestimating your coping ability. Or in plain English, thinking something really awful is about to happen and I don't know how to cope with it is a typical cognitive schema for anxiety. So with panic, not in all forms of panic, but in many of them, people may believe that they're having a heart attack and they're going to die, right? Now, you can see why that might worry them.
Sure.
Like, they're thinking, I'll never finish that novel that I'm working on now. Like, or whatever, right? I've yet to see all the episodes of Friends, they might say. Like, it doesn't seem fair. Like, so if you believed you're imminently about to drop dead, you'd be justifiably alarmed by that, generally speaking. And so people with panic attacks believe that they're going to have a heart attack and die. Now, cut a long story short, they're wrong. Like, typically, they're not in any physical danger at all. Like, it's a classic example of a very common problem where people misinterpret physical sensations as meaning something different from what they actually mean. So there's a tightness in my chest and a kind of pain and discomfort. So I think I'm having a heart attack. No, that's just caused by anxiety. Like, those are the physical sensations of anxiety that you're experiencing. I'm short of breath, symptom of anxiety, right? Like, you're experiencing anxiety, not a heart attack. Now, when that underlying belief is addressed in cognitive therapy, and if it's genuinely disproven to the client, and so that they're able to reevaluate it and modify it, then their panic reduces in severity and frequency, and they feel more able to cope with it. They get better, in other words. If you just say, I can't help it, it's just how I feel, then you are stuck. But if you think, no, there's a reason why I feel this way, and partly it's got to do with my behaviour, and partly it's got to do with the fact that I believe stuff which may or may not be true. Like, Aaron Beck used to illustrate this by saying, imagine you wake up in the middle of the night and it's dark. Like, and you've made the mistake, buddy, of eating a lot of blue cheese, and you've been watching horror films, and you hear a creaking noise, and immediately you think the worst. You think it's that Jason guy with a hockey mask or whatever, it's a serial killer or something. Somebody, they're going to kill me in my sleep. And so your heart starts pounding. You're justifiably anxious because you think something really bad is probably about to happen, and you're not able to cope with it. So you get scared. And you get out of your bed and you peek tentatively around the corner. You realise it's the cat. Right now, you'll probably continue to feel anxious for a little while. Your heart will continue to beat, but pretty soon it's going to go back to normal.
Sure.
Because you realise that your anxiety was unfounded.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Or I'm going to a really important job interview, and I missed my train, right? And now I'm anxious because I think I've blown it. I'm going to be late, not get the job. So I feel really anxious about that, or angry or depressed. Then I realise my watch is wrong, and actually I'm an hour early. So it might take me a while to calm down, but unless I'm properly crazy, I'm going to calm down because there was a mistake that I made. I'm not actually late. I'm now early, right? So cognitions cause emotions, in many different ways. And normally, normal human functioning is that when we correct a misconception that's causing anger or anxiety, normally, albeit after some delay, we go back to normal.
Sure.
Right? So this is why the Stoics realized that 2,300 years ago. Freud didn't know that. He thought anxiety was all caused by repressed castration anxiety. And the best thing you could do about it was lie on a couch and talk about your dreams and how you felt about your mother and stuff like that, right? He was way off at a tangent. The Stoics were no, buddy, it's the stuff that you're thinking. It's your beliefs about things that are causing your anxiety. And Aerelius in the 50s was maybe those guys had a point after all. I don't know. We've been ignoring them for 2,000 years. Maybe it's time we gave them a second chance. And so cognitive therapists began doing research on the cognitive model and testing it out in clinical practice. And they're oh, geez, man, turns out this works. Apparently, if you prove to someone they're having a panic attack that they're not actually going to die of a heart attack, that helps them in combination with a bunch of other things. I think that one of the main things is this, getting people to realize the cognitive nature of their emotions. That opens up. You cannot use this whole toolbox. It's closed to you of cognitive therapy techniques. But once you realize, and most people don't, but once you realize the cognitive nature of emotion, you open up this whole toolbox that you can now use.
So I want to get this quote out from Epictetus about it's basically life is opinion. I think that is such a powerful, let's call it a soundbite for this case, but the quality of our life is determined by our value judgments. That's essentially a lot of what you've been talking about, and that shapes our emotions. It's not the things, his famous quote, it's not the things that upset us, but our judgment about those things. Talk us through that. You've touched on that already, but can you build into that a little? Because I think there's a lot of power behind that statement.
Well, it bears repeating. He said, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that's I would say, personally, there might be some debate about this, but I typically would say that that's the single most influential and famous quote in all of the Stoic literature, for the simple reason that when I was a young guy and I started training in psychotherapy, that quote was in pretty much every book on CBT that I read. Like, and every single CBT, every cognitive behavioral therapist that I met knew that quote. It was a cliche, right? Because it sums up the cognitive model of emotion that we were just talking about in layman's terms. See, if you're an evidence-based clinician, part of your job, in a sense, is kind of like a public health. It's similar to public health promotion, because you have to read a lot of pretty hardcore technical psychological research, unless you're a complete nerd and you really love statistics, right? I mean, a lot of therapists who do CBT get a shock when they realize how much statistics they are involved in doing it. Like, so you've got to read some pretty hardcore health research and stats and stuff, and it takes a lot of study to do that. Unless you're on the internet now and you're debating the pandemic, in which case it doesn't take any study to understand statistical research. Apparently, everyone's like an expert.
Exactly.
Like, but normally it takes like 2 years of postgraduate training or whatever. Like, so you study health research, and then you sit down in front of an old lady that works in a bakery, or a wee boy that punched somebody at school, or a guy who drives a bus, or a CEO or whatever, you know, in every round, it's the spin of the wheel of which client walks into your consulting room next, right? It could be anybody. Like, it could be a bricklayer. Like, you know, it could be a guy that designs artificial intelligence for a living or whatever, who knows? Like, and then you have to explain to them how their problem functions, drawing on this really nerdy research, but you have to put it into plain English for them, right? So there are reams of research studies on the cognitive model of emotion that would bore the tears off of 99% of those clients. Like, and so the way therapists would explain it to them is that they think, geez, man, if only we had like a simple way that was kind of catchy. We need the catchphrase. Like, if there was something we could say that basically said the same thing, like more or less. And they, apparently Epictetus said it 2,300 years ago. Like, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about that. That's pretty much. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit more nuance in that, and there's some exceptions and stuff like. But basically, that's the gist of it. So Ellis taught that quote to all of his clients and all of his students, and it's in most of the many, far too many probably, books that he wrote over the years. And so it became very, very famous. Now, it is a simplification, right? Even the Stoics realized that if you want to get a message across, sometimes you have to kind of simplify it a little bit. You know, and Epictetus was quite good about that. He said, I can tell you the slogans, but then to unpack them, the conversation gets longer, right? But, you know, the shorthand version is, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about it. And so the difference is that cognitive therapists, there's different types of cognitive therapy. There are many types of cognitive therapy, in fact. But the most famous type of cognitive therapy is Aaron Beck's approach. And Beck's approach was basically to say that there are many different types of thoughts and beliefs that can cause different emotional problems. He wasn't reductionist about it. It was more, you could say, a bottom-up approach. He would say, we'll get the client to record their thoughts, and then we'll look for patterns in them. And there are models that we can use to identify typical patterns, like the one I mentioned earlier for anxiety. But it was, to a greater extent, a less of a philosophical, more of an empirical, more of a bottom-up approach. So he looked at a lot of different types of beliefs. The Stoics took more of a philosophical top-down approach, and Ellis is somewhere in between. So the Stoics said, in principle, we think there's really one type of thought. If, you know, we've been talking about this, like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus said, we and the other Stoics, the other guys, we've been hanging around the porch talking about this for 300 years, and we've arrived at the conclusion, like, we all seem to think it's basically one type of thought that's the biggie. Sure, there's other thoughts that are a problem, we acknowledge that, but there's one biggie. And that big one that causes a lot of problems is really a value judgment. Now, when I first came across this, I thought Beck didn't put enough emphasis on this, in my opinion. it seemed to me that any schoolboy would tell you that of all the beliefs that we have, the ones that make us angry and anxious and depressed tend to be ones that involve some sort of value judgment. So we could at least focus there more. And the Stoics arrived at that conclusion. And they said, look, the big problem is when people place too much value on things that are not under their direct control. Like, that's a recipe for neurosis, they may have said. And not enough value on the way that they voluntarily respond to those things. Like, they've got it back to front in most cases. And that really is the core of Stoicism. Like, they think we place far too much value, positive and negative, on external goods, on fortune, the vicissitudes of fortune, as they would put it. Or as Epictetus says, Epictetus wrote a handbook of Stoic philosophy. So sometimes people say to me, geez, do you know what would be really good if somebody put on the internet a kind of idiot's guide to Stoicism that's just like, a condensed version of it? And I think, Epictetus did that 2,300 years ago. We actually have that. Like, we have this thing called the Enchiridion, or the handbook. That's like a bullet point version of Stoicism. He wrote it for students as a little, Cliff Notes guide. And the opening sentence of it is, in a sense, one of the most famous. That passage is not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about it, is passage 5, right? But there's one that comes before it that's more fundamental, but slightly less famous, although it's reasonably well known. It says some things are up to us and other things are not.
Some things are what?
Some things are up to us and other things are not, Epictetus says. And then he goes on in the next sentence to clarify what he means by that. So he says, in a nutshell, our own actions are up to us and everything else isn't. By definition, our own volition, our own voluntary action is what's up to us.
Right.
I.e., how we respond to events is up to us. But the events themselves are not directly up to us. Sure, we can influence them. How do we influence them? By our actions, which are under our voluntary control. There's the only thing that's directly 100% up to us. And Epictetus,
which then influences the emotions. Which then, when you take those actions, that then circles back and influences the emotions, which allow you to take even more positive actions. So the Stoics think that by failing to make a clear psychological distinction between the sphere of our control, Stephen Covey, by the way, has exactly the same idea in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or whatever it's called. Yeah. The sphere of control, I think he calls it. Mm-hmm. So this is a recurring idea in self-help literature. But the Stoics got there first, right? They were the granddaddies of self-help. They really did. So they think, look, most people are surprisingly confused about this because we're all idiots, right? So we get confused about something as basic as this, right? So the Stoics say, if we can draw a clear line around what's under our direct control, and then all the other stuff, right? First of all, are we actually utilizing our control over all of the stuff that we have voluntary control over? No, we neglect to do that typically. A lot of the stuff that's under voluntary control, we use like an untended garden. Weirdly, people spend a lot of time banging their head against the wall of external stuff that's not actually under their direct control, or even internal stuff. Right. Some of our thoughts and feelings are what psychologists today call automatic thoughts. They're involuntary. They just kind of happen to you. They pop into your head, right? So at a very simple level, in many stressful situations, people today will say anecdotally that they find it helpful. There's also some research about this, but not a lot. Many people say they find it helpful just to pause and clarify. Therapists today, cognitive therapists, love flip charts. They always have done, right? And one of the things they love to do with the flip, because they're not really sure what to do with the flip chart, especially if you've got bad handwriting, it gets a bit messy. So one of the things they like to do is draw a line down the middle, right? And they go, I'm just drawing 2 columns, right? And it's also because therapists get confused easily. So they think, let's just draw 2 columns here, column A and column B, right? That's all my head can handle at the moment, right? And they go, this situation, at work or whatever in your marriage, right? Which aspects of it
are not under your control. We'll put it in column B. Which aspects of it are under your control? Put in column E. Right, spoiler alert. The stuff that's under your control is probably how you act. Like, basically, that's under your direct control. Anything else that you can influence is only under your control because of the way that you act, the things that you say and do. Right? Your locus of control is entirely comes back to your own volition, your own voluntary actions, right? And so how much time do you spend thinking about the stuff that's not under your control, or how much time you spend thinking about the stuff that's actually under your voluntary control? Yeah. Well, it's pretty clear. Most people are overly preoccupied with the stuff that they can't control, which leads to frustration because they can't control it. And they neglect half of the stuff that's in column A. Like, they've got all these tools that are lying around, they're tripping over it, and they I just tripped over that power. Like,
why do we do that?
There's all these things that could be doing that they're just ignoring.
Why is
we're stupid?
Why is that happening? Well, yeah, but it just, it makes so much sense as you're saying. I'll tell you.
Yeah, it's really simple, right? So there's got to be an explanation. Stupidity is not an explanation, right? It's a non-explanation. So there's got to be a better explanation of why we do it. My best attempt to explain it. And also, you might ask, there's a question within your question, which is not only why do we do that, why have we always done it?
Exactly.
Why were the ancient
and why do all of us
the ancient Egyptians did it, the Romans did it.
Yeah.
And we're still doing it, right? Despite thousands and thousands of research studies in the field of psychology, thousands of self-help books, and we're still just as bad at this as we were 2,300 years ago in the time of Socrates, 2,400 years ago in his case. Why? Right, this is my attempt at an explanation. And I think this is kind of, the Stoics, to me, seem to touch on this. They imply this. I think it's because when we're born, we can't speak. We haven't developed language. We pop into the world like a dumb animal. Like, we have consciousness, but we don't know the English language, right? So we have a limited capacity for abstract reasoning at birth, which makes us dependent on modeling the behavior of other people around us for survival, right? We can't go and look stuff up on the internet as babies, sadly, right? So what do we do? In order to figure out whether something's dangerous or not, or whether we should put something in our mouth, we look at our parents and copy what they're doing. We observe their reactions and allow that to influence our behavior. So as infants, we are thoroughly dependent for our survival for a prolonged period, for a long time, compared to other mammals. Other mammals pop out, they're crawling about, blind, a couple of weeks they're up on their legs running around, right? Human babies are completely dependent on their parents for survival for years.
Right.
Far longer than other mammals. It's unnatural. It's very strange. We're the most fragile of all infants. So for a long time, an unnaturally long time, we have to depend on other people for guidance in order to survive, and we emulate the behaviour of other people. And then we gradually acquire language and self-consciousness, and we're able to reason and use logic and articulate things. But by that time, it's too late. We've already internalized values by observing the external behavior of other people without having insight to their internal thinking and motivation. So I think the trap we fall into is that we acquire our initial patterns of behavior by a superficial impression based on the external. So we look around us and we see other people are trying to earn a lot of money. They're trying to impress everybody. They're trying to buy a big car and all that. But if we could see in their hearts, we'd maybe realise that those things aren't what's ultimately important to them. They're a means to an end. Maybe the guy's trying to earn money because he wants to protect and look after his family or something. That's what he really values, right? The money's just a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. But you don't see that on the outside, right? So my best attempt to explain this is because we're stuck as infants, modelling for years the external behaviour of other people. It creates a profound bias, which leads us to internalise a superficial set of values from the society around us, and we're doomed to do that forever just because of this very biological fact.
Right.
The way that we're designed, we're bound to acquire superficial values by observing other people. It takes self-consciousness and reflection to get beyond the surface level and realize that what people really want in life is some kind of fulfillment. Socrates, in the Stoics, we get a kind of bullet point version of Socrates, right? And if you want to understand the Stoics, you have to read the Socratic dialogues of Plato and Xenophon and other bits and pieces. And the best explanation of the Stoic position, sadly, no one is going to read Plato today, right? Or very few people, because we all have short attention spans. We go on Twitter. Like, Plato's dialogues are quite long and really require some concentration, some study, like reading Shakespeare or something. It kind of requires a bit of effort. So some people will, but you're more likely to study Plato at university. Like, not that many, fewer and fewer people pick it up just as a kind of like hobby between episodes of Friends. I'll just plough through the symposium. Like, it's hard. It takes effort to study Plato. But in one of the dialogues, Euthydemus, I can give you a summary version of the argument that Socrates says, because it's very simple. Dialogue's long. But Socrates is talking to his interlocutor, and he asks him to define good fortune. It's typical Socratic method. So he gets somebody to define usually like a virtue or some kind of important key term in terms of our daily life, the things that we value most, our philosophy of life. So he says, well, good. What constitutes good fortune? Like, what constitutes the goal of life, like flourishing? Like, it's pretty important. It's pretty fundamental. What does it consist in? Now, Socrates typically begins with a question that seems stupid. It seems like, to his interlocutors, it seems like a rhetorical question.
Right.
Like, so they're like, well, good fortune, Socrates, like, I don't even know why you're asking me this, right? Because it involves, like, having a big house, having lots of money, like, having an important position in society, a beautiful wife, like, being really fit and strong and handsome and, like, I'll take, all that kind of stuff, right? That's what good fortune, because I like winning the lottery and stuff like that, right? Like, why are we wasting our time with these dumb questions? So that's how Socrates usually begins these dialogues, right? So he's kind of playing the part of being naive and asking a rhetorical question. And he says, geez, I guess you've got a point there. Like, maybe it's really interesting. Good answer, right? There's a bunch of things that you named. First of all, subtle, interesting point. There are multiple things. It's a long list, right, of things that constitute.
Sure.
Socrates says, let's take each one of those things in turn, right? Now, I'll save you a lot of trouble, right? He only really needs to pick one of them to make his point. So he picks money because it's traditionally the easiest example. He says, let's take a big pile of money, right? Let's give that big pile of money to somebody who's wise and virtuous. Is that a good thing? Well, maybe. Like, they could do wise and virtuous stuff with it. Like, they could do a lot of good things, like wise and virtuous guy, if you give him a big pile of money. So it seems like that would be good fortune. Right on. So far, so good. But he says, like, Columbo. Do you remember Columbo, the detective on TV? Like, and in every episode, he'd be walking out the door, and then he'd turn around and he'd go, just one more thing. Like, he'd kind of play a bit dumb. So Socrates is like Columbo. He'd go, oh, yeah, right. It seems like that would be good fortune. And he's about to walk away, and he goes, just one more thing, right? What if you took that big pile of money and gave it to somebody who's foolish and vicious? His interlocutor says, Socrates says, wouldn't he just use it to do more foolish and vicious stuff? Wouldn't it be like that meme about coffee? Like, coffee allows you to do stupid things more quickly and with more energy. Like, wouldn't money just allow him to do more foolish things and more vicious things more quickly and with more energy? Like, it would just allow him, what money does, it's a means to an end. It gives you more influence over your environment. But whether you use that for good or evil, it's going to depend on your character, right? So money in itself is neither good nor bad. It's just a tool. Like, it can be used for evil, like, or it can be used for good. But it comes back to your character. So at this point, Socrates says, spoiler alert, this applies to everything else that you listed, right? So having lots of friends, right, that's great if you're wise and virtuous. What if you're an evil dictator? Like, and you could utilize those friends to influence society more. They're helping you to do evil dictatorial things, potentially. Like, all of the things that you mentioned really just extend your control of your environment, and they're not good in themselves. So his interlocutor says, well, maybe what matters is the use that you make of things. Socrates says, what would allow you to use things well? Wisdom, the type of knowledge about moral value, a kind of moral wisdom would allow you to use things well. So with a flourish, he basically concludes, maybe all of the things you named are kind of external advantages. They're a means to an end. They're neither good nor bad in themselves. But the only truly good thing would be knowing how to use them well, which we could call moral wisdom. And the only truly bad thing would be moral ignorance, or vice, which would mean that you would use all of those advantages badly.
Right.
And he says, even weirder, if you deprive somebody of those good things, if they have sufficient wisdom and moral strength, they might actually be able to use that well. So poverty might be used well by somebody who's wise and virtuous. They might learn from it. It might actually improve them in some ways if they can handle it appropriately. Being persecuted by other people, to somebody who has sufficient wisdom, that might be actually something they turn to their advantage and use well. So he says the wise man can flourish in any situation, in fact. But he says the fool uses everything badly. And also the fool believes that he needs 101 things. He's got a long list of stuff that he thinks he needs. The wise man thinks he only needs one thing, which is moral wisdom. So he's more grounded and more focused on a more unifying goal. He's has what the Stoics called the consistency or constancy of the sage. He's only really got his eye on one fundamental thing, and everything else is secondary to that. He has a focus, a goal. The fool doesn't have a goal. He's running around left, right, and centre over 101 different external goods, and he thinks he needs every one of them, but he's using them all badly. So, the Stoics want to say, really, our fundamental goal should be to use reason well and achieve this kind of moral wisdom. And then when we do that, a side effect of it is that we'll achieve emotional resilience, because to be deprived of wealth, reputation, or health would be traumatic for somebody who believes that that's the goal of life. Right. And the life depends on those things. But someone who, like Socrates, who thinks that moral wisdom is the number one most important thing in life, and all of those second things are merely a means to an end, is going to be inherently more able to endure poverty, persecution, and ill health, right? Because those things are not the most important thing to him.
Okay, Donald, I've got two more questions, but one of the ones I've been dying to ask you is talk about external stuff. The sports fan. Mm-hmm. I know Aurelius was not known to be much of a sports fan. He would go and sit with people and use that for chatting time, etc. But I'm thinking of, the football fan, basketball fan, soccer fan, whatever, who they love the emotional attachment to that team, the highs and the lows and all that kind of stuff. That's part of the enjoyment. Is there a way to apply Stoicism to reduce some of those lows without losing the highs? Can you do anything for us on this one?
I'm going to give you an argument that'll do the opposite.
Oh, no.
Right? And I'm going to, because I love this, right? So when we're studying Socrates, Socrates was executed, right? And he said himself that his arguments really annoyed a lot of people, but some people really loved it. So some people take to this, some people don't. And Socrates has a very open-ended approach. The Socratic method often just raises questions to get people to think more deeply. So in that spirit, I'm going to present the following argument.
Okay, here we go. I'm ready.
I believe it's one of Xenophon's dialogues, right? And so with Socrates, you're always left thinking, I'm not sure if he's even serious about this. Is he joking? Or is he kind of half joking? This is what he says. So once he was outside Athens and he met a famous wrestler. And the guy was over the moon, had a spring in his step. Socrates said, what are you so happy about, buddy? The guy said, I just won the wrestling at the Olympic Games, the ancient Olympics, right? It's a pretty big deal, buddy, right? It's a pretty big deal. I won. He's ecstatic. He's probably had a few drinks, right, to celebrate. And Socrates says to him, so the guys that you beat, this is really amazing, right? So tell me about it. The guys that you beat, were they stronger than you or weaker than you? And the wrestler says, well, like, I'm stronger than them. Like, I proved it by beating them, right? I'm the strongest guy in Athens. Like, I just demonstrated that, I think you'll find. And Socrates said, oh, right, okay, like, were the guys that you beat, were they more skilled than you or less skilled than you at wrestling? It's like, obviously I was more skilled than them. That's why I beat them, right? He said, the guys that you beat, like, were they more determined than you or less determined than you? He said, I was more determined than any of them to win. That's why I was so successful. And Socrates then said to him, well, in that case, what honour or glory is there in beating men that are weaker, less skilled, and less determined than you? Like, so I love this because when I say this to sportsmen, they're like, I don't agree with that, but it's kind of interesting. Yeah. Like, and I can see where that's the feeling you have with many of the Socratic dialogues, right? Either you just get really annoyed with the guy and kind of slap him and say, we need to execute this guy before he says anything else like this. Or you think, I'm not sure I agree with you, Socrates. I'm not entirely sure how serious you are, but that is kind of interesting, what you said. It's got me thinking. Like, and I kind of am tempted to agree with him a little bit. I find it hard to get kind of passionate about competitive sports. And I suppose one of the things that reminds us of today is when we see cheating in sports and stuff like that. It maybe takes away the kind of excitement, potentially. There's sometimes the curtains pulled back, and we realise that it's not as level a playing field as we thought it was. And so for modern audiences, that happens more and more. I think, and sometimes that can spoil sports, but also in principle, I think there are things that change in our society. That make us view competition and sport a little bit differently. So for me, it does, thinking about what competition means, takes away some of the excitement, some of the edge from it. But I'll leave that with you and your audience to ponder, arrive at your own conclusions about. In terms of if your team lose and you're traumatized by that, I think, let me see. The best advice that I can give is the Stoics would say, first of all, if your team just won all of the time, what fun would there be in that, right?
I don't know, I'd like to try it a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes, right? But the most exciting thing ever is when an underdog wins, right? Right. It's no fun watching somebody who just wins all the time. After a while, it kind of gets boring, right? That's one of the paradoxes of sport. The most exciting thing is when an underdog somehow wins. That's why people like the Rocky movie. Right.
Absolutely.
It's probably a kind of classic example of it. That's what's so cool about it.
Yeah.
So there's a positive side to it. The ancient Greeks knew that their theatre, their tragedy, revolved around reversals of fortune, right? And so they would say, often when there's a setback in the play, it's followed by somebody managing to make it good. Or when somebody has great fortune, then something bad often follows. So just from watching the way that stories panned out in theatre, they got used to the feeling that life has ups and downs and that you shouldn't get too hung up on any individual one of them. When you broaden your perspective and think about the story as a whole, you realise for it to be interesting, there has to be some contrast between ups and downs. But when we get upset about things, we focus on the events in isolation. We become wiser and have a more balanced and really ultimately a more rewarding experience of things when we look at the complexity, the tapestry of life, and we accept that there's going to be both highs and lows. And when we're in a low, we realise this too shall pass and it's not going to last forever. And it's going to make the high all the more rewarding, when it eventually comes around. And I think that's a more philosophical attitude towards sport.
Right. Okay. Last one, my friend. This is for you. How have you integrated Stoicism in your life differently today than you did 5 or 10 years ago? So this is just you. This is Donald. What are you doing on a practical level to integrate it more than you were 10 years ago, 5 years ago?
That's a hard question because I've been following Stoicism for
that's what I was thinking. Is it ongoing here? Exactly.
Same way for a long time. What have I changed in the last 5 years or so? I think there are certain things that I used to do that used to be techniques, and now they've become more habitual to me. So one of them is, if something happens, I almost can't help myself now, but to think, how am I going to feel about this looking back on it 10 years from now? So before, I'd have to sit down and kind of make an effort to do that. And now it feels like it's just part of my character. You know, I've done it so many times. Over the past 5 years or so, I notice that I'm doing that automatically, like without even thinking about it. Yeah, I just kind of, if there's a setback, I instinctively think, you know, what's it going to look like 5 years from now when I look back on it? I'm probably going to think, oh yeah, that sucked, but you know, like I moved on from it. Like, how does it fit into the grand scheme of things? So looking at the big picture and expanding our horizons, I think this is, I guess, a lesson from sports as well. You know, if you're training to do some kind of shot or some kind of move, like at first it's conscious and effortful, but after a while it gets in the muscle memory and it becomes something that's unconscious and automatic and spontaneous.
I love that. That's powerful. And I think that's what people are trying to get to, is taking the things that you've walked us through today and not just conscious. It's the old conscious competence, conscious incompetence, unconscious competence, et cetera. That's what we're trying to get to. So great stuff. We went a lot longer than I promised you, but there was so much in there. Sorry. Thank you for joining us. This is fantastic. I've been digesting Robertson's and others' writings on Stoicism the past few years and was really looking forward to this one. I hope it sparks some new insights for you and your life going forward as well. Thanks for tuning in to the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. It's hard to believe we're knocking on 300 episodes. We really appreciate all the kind notes, and we especially appreciate it when you forward an episode to a friend, as that's the only way folks find us in this sea of podcasts. So thank you if that's you. As always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career. Results at catalystcoaching360.com. And if you're an employer, EAP, or wellness provider looking to integrate best-in-class coaching into your benefits or services, we're here for you. Same email or visit our website, catalystcoaching360.com. And now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360. I will speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.